Welcome to Countdown to Classic, a podcast that educates, informs, and gossips about World of Warcraft Classic. Every Monday and Wednesday, we discuss the news, hot button issues, and content of the highly anticipated World of Warcraft Classic. I'm your host, Josh Corbett, and I'm an avid fan of the vanilla days of World of Warcraft and a podcast veteran, so I figured, why not combine my two passions and bring you this show that you're hearing right now. With this being one of our Way Back Wednesday episodes, we'll be taking a very deep dive into the lore of World of Warcraft, and more importantly with this particular episode, the history of a very specific event, and discussing in detail the content that arises. Now, all the information that you're going to hear today is sourced from World of Warcraft content, comics, novelizations, the amazing WoW Wiki website, Wowpedia, Engadget, and various sources online. So whilst this episode is a regurgitation of much of what you can read on those particular websites, please do bear with me if anything is wrong. But if I do get anything wrong, then write to the show at feedback@countdowntoclassic.com and let me know, and I'll happily correct it in a future episode. But what we're going to do now is, after talking about the lore, we'll discuss what you, yes, you there running into your 9th consecutive battleground for the day right now, we'll discuss what you said about the content back in the day, and some of the more memorable aspects of the content from the community's point of view. But just before we get to the good stuff, please do bear with me for just a little bit of housekeeping. I just want to let you know that you can find all things Countdown to Classic online at countdowntoclassic.com. More importantly, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts from, and like, follow, or subscribe to the show on social media. You can find the show on Instagram and Facebook at Countdown to Classic, on Twitter at Counts2Classic with the number 2, and on the show's YouTube channel at Countdown to Classic. One small favor I would ask is that if you're currently listening to the show on YouTube and you're liking what you're hearing, then please do click the download or stream links on the website as well, as I primarily lean on those figures as a look into how the show is growing. Now, Countdown to Classic is a show about you, the players, and because of such, this is a very interactive experience, and I really want to hear your feedback or your input on the show. You can drop me a line at any time on all the social media accounts, or email feedback@countdowntoclassic.com. Guys, a lot of people have started emailing me now, and it's fantastic. I love waking up every morning and seeing emails from the fans from all over the world saying, hey Josh, do this, do that. We'd love to hear about this particular aspect. Shout out from this country. It's fantastic, and it really does warm my heart. So please do say hello if you listen. Now, hang around until the end of the show, because we'll have a few more thank yous and shout outs and some further show updates. But for now, it's time to stop messing about and get to the good stuff with a scoop of vanilla. Ahn'Qiraj is the city kingdom of the Qiraji, a race of insectoid creatures found in the southern part of Silithus. Silithus is an area located in the southwestern corner of Kalimdor. It can only be reached on foot by travelling to the northwestern corner of Un'Goro crater. Ahn'Qiraj was originally a Titan research station, with the Titans being a race of colossal, planet-sized cosmic beings composed of arcane magic and the primordial matter from which the universe was born. This research station housed the old god Cthulhu. Old gods were parasitic eldritch horrors who are physical manifestations of the void. Cthulhu is the old god of madness and chaos, one of the 4 ancient and powerful creatures who ruled the world of Azeroth long ago, before being defeated and imprisoned by servants of the Titans. Cthulhu created the Qiraji. Now, I'm not sure if you're one of those people who likes Cthulhu or Cthulhu or I know some people say Seathorn, and I'm not going to lie, I was one of those people who used to say Seathorn. But you know how we are with pronunciation here. I've got a certain way. If that's not your way, then so be it. But we're going to go with, I think I'll go Cthulhu. Okay, here we go. Ahn'Qiraj was eventually commandeered by the Aqir, who, with Cthulhu's intervention, would become the Qiraji, led by the twin emperors, Veknalash and Veklor, who rule over the Qiraji from the sanctuary of their temple. Following the War of the Shifting Sands, a major conflict which took place in southern Kalimdor between an allied campaign of night elves and dragons and the immense armies of the Qiraji and Lesser Silithid about 975 years before the First War, the Ahn'Qiraj kingdom was contained from the rest of the world by the Scarab Wall, an impressive, seemingly impenetrable wall that was also subject to some sort of magical shield that also prevents creatures capable of flight from simply flying over it. And so it remained until we came along. Now, just very quickly also, I think this was the official Blizz description of Ahn'Qiraj back in the day, and it went like this. Little is known of the ancient kingdom of Ahn'Qiraj, save for scattered legends concerning its creators, the enigmatic sorcerers known as the Qiraji. Night elf tales abound of the Qiraji's strange hold over the insect-like Silithid, and their symbiotic link with the terrifying race. It has become clear that the Qiraji are stirring once again behind the sand-blasted walls of their kingdom. The Silithid have begun to amass in the southern regions of Kalimdor. None know what vast evil might spew forth if the gates of Ahn'Qiraj were ever breached. So that's the quick summary of the kingdom of Ahn'Qiraj. But before we get to the lore of all things Ahn'Qiraj, what we're actually going to be doing here on Countdown to Classic today is focusing first and foremost on the event that a lot of us took part in back in the vanilla days, the opening of the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj. Because what we'll be doing in tackling this subject of Ahn'Qiraj as a whole is actually taking it down over 2 weeks. Yes, Countdown to Classic's first ever 2-parter for our lore episodes. So I can't wait until I do like a 6-parter on Thrall. That'll be wild. But this week, we'll just be doing the event of the opening of the gates and the history of how we dealt with that. And next week, what we'll do is we'll get to the actual nitty-gritty of the lore of obviously AQ20, AQ40, the whole thing. We'll get there. But today, just the opening of the gates and what we went through to get those damn things open. Okay, so the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj. Patch 1.9 of World of Warcraft was released on January 3rd of 2006, and it holds a very special place in my heart as this was the patch that was in effect when I started my journey in Azeroth. And while I really embraced the game and dove in time-wise a bit more around patch 1.10, I first saw the game in patch 1.9. But what came with patch 1.9? Well, it was quite the doozy content-wise, as we see amongst the following items that were in the release notes. The Gates of Ahn'Qiraj world event, the Ruins of Ahn'Qiraj, an outdoor 20-player instance, the Temple of Ahn'Qiraj, an indoor 40-player instance, new Tier 2 epic armor models and graphics, linked auction houses, raid dungeon timers, shard bags, and multiple battlegrounds queues were amongst the many items that were added to the game in patch 1.9. Now, amongst the content mentioned there, however, obviously the primary focus here and what we're beginning with is that Gates of Ahn'Qiraj world event. Now, the synopsis behind this world event was: an insectoid menace awaits Enceladus in the ancient brooding city of Ahn'Qiraj that represents a danger to both Horde and Alliance and their place in Azeroth. However, no forces can preemptively deal with the threat unless they can breach the enchanted Scarab Wall and open the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj, closed during the War of the Shifting Sands. The Gates of Ahn'Qiraj are sealed by powerful magic, and to open them, an elite guild must brave a number of trials to reconstruct a long-lost artifact, the Scepter of the Shifting Sands. This scepter can open the walls, but behind the walls, a mighty Qiraji army lays in wait. To repel it, the combined military might of both the Alliance and Horde must be ready outside the wall, and to be ready, a great number of supplies must be gathered: food, bandages, metals and herbs. Once all is ready, the player who holds the scepter can open the gates, and the Ahn'Qiraj War can begin. Now, this Ahn'Qiraj war effort that we've just touched on, the creations of scepters and gathering of materials and a lining up of an army at a gates, what was it all about? Well, the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj and their opening was one of World of Warcraft's first attempts at a massive server-wide world event. It was opened by us. We were the ones who had the input purely on how quickly or slowly those gates would be opened. Now, this was a very intriguing concept, obviously, to players at the time. Putting something as important as this in our hands and saying, look, these things might never open, quite frankly. It's up to you guys. Do what you will and see how you go. And servers responded accordingly. Some truly embraced the war effort and poured all of their efforts into that one focus. Others perhaps were a bit more laissez-faire about it or suffered from lower population numbers. But we'll get into all of that eventually. Now, generally the event was known to be plagued with a lot of server crashes and performance problems. And if you ask a lot of players from back in the day, they'll obviously mention those things when talking about the event. However, one notable common occurrence when you hear players talking about the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj as well is this. It's one of people's favorite WoW memories. It's an event that a lot of players are incredibly fond of. And as I say, because it's so beloved, there is a certain amount of love and affection that comes with this event. So I'll talk about it I'll try and treat it with the kind of, respect that it deserves, if you will. But we'll go into what actually took place in opening these gates. Now, opening the gates was a process that could have spanned, as I mentioned, weeks or months, depending on the server. It required the cooperation of hundreds of players, or thousands, from all races and factions, involving monsters and quests from all corners of the world map. So, we basically had a three-pronged plan of attack once it came to the opening of the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj. We were made aware that we had to do these three things in order to crack the safe. 1, we had to gather materials for the war effort. 2, we had to convince the hardcore guilds who had the time to commit to the effort to basically drive all of their focus towards the reconstructing of the Scepter of the Shifting Sands. 3, we had to amass and organize a cross-factional army at the gates at a predetermined time, if you were lucky on your server, for when the scepter is used, and then all take on whatever spews forth from behind the gates. So, with those three things in mind, we'll walk through the history of those 3 steps one by one and talk about what we went through back in the day. Now, the first point that I mentioned was the war effort, or gathering the materials for the war effort. Both Alliance and Horde players had to effectively work together to gather war supplies for the combined army of the two factions. Now, this was an incredibly foreign concept to World of Warcraft players, suggesting to a Horde player to work with the Alliance scum, or suggesting to an Alliance player to now cooperate with the filthy Horde, boggled the mind. However, it was all for the greater good. So, putting our differences aside for a short while, we worked out that cooperation was key to the success of our server. This first stage of getting that gate open could easily have lasted several real-time months due to the sheer number of supplies that must be gathered, as well as competing against other servers in what became a bit of a space race in trying to get the event started before the other servers could. Everyone wanted to be first, and as gamers we crave those titles of first, and here we are 12 years later after the event still talking about it. Some mad Australian on the other side of the world from you is doing a podcast about the history of the opening of the AQ gates. Goes to show how important of an event this was and how much it meant to people to go down in the annals of history of being one of the first to do it. So you've heard me mention this vast amount of items that must be gathered by both factions in order to supply the supplies for the war effort. Now, what were these items and exactly what kind of figures are we talking here, Josh? Well, it was a lot, and very quickly here's what we had to get. Now, both factions had to gather 90,000 copper bars, 26,000 purple lotus, 80,000 thick leathers, 17,000 spotted yellowtails, and 400,000 rune cloth bandages. The Alliance, and just the Alliance, had to gather 28,000 iron bars, 24,000 thorium bars, 20,000 of Arthas's tears, just picturing Arthas crying them all out, but I know that's not how it went, but 33,000 strangle kelp, 180,000 light leather, jeez, 110,000 medium leather, 20,000 roast raptor, 14,000 rainbow fin albacore, 800,000 linen bandages, and 600,000 silk bandages. Whoa! The Horde had to gather 22,000 tin bars, 18,000 mithril bars, 96,000 peace bloom. That's a lot of herbalism. 19,000 fire bloom, 60,000 heavy leather, 60,000 rugged leather, 10,000 lean wolf steaks, 10,000 baked salmons, 250,000 wool bandages, and 250,000 mage weave bandages, and let's say a partridge in a pear tree. Sure, why not? Now, each item had its own NPC for turn-in. This was actually a pretty good way to farm reputation as well with capital cities, as the only other option at the time was cloth turn-ins. Now, each turn-in required a full stack of the item, 10 or 20 depending on the item. And it would also award you 10 commendation signets and a box of Ahn'Qiraj war effort supplies. The first time you hand in one stack. For the second hand-in of the same item, the amount of signets depends on the level of the item. So high-level items will still give you 10 signets each time, mid-level items will give you 7 signets, and 5 signets from the third hand-in on. Low-level items apparently only give 1 signet, starting with the third turn-in. Now that you've heard all of those crazy figures, obviously you can now digest and understand that the Ahn'Qiraj war effort was no small task. The entire server had to come together and help. Everyone had to chip in. Everyone's doing their part. It's like the beginning of Starship Troopers. Like, I'm doing my part. Everyone was, having their say in how things were to go if you were collecting these materials. This is war, and everyone kind of had to take a bit of a hit and help out. Now, due to that, there were shortages of every single one of the items that I mentioned earlier. And all of a sudden, players had a bit of a conundrum placed before them. You now had to decide what was more important to you and your interests, or that of the servers and the greater good. This choice added to the grand nature of the event itself. These supplies were for a war effort. Both factions going to war for the peace of the world against this imposing enemy. They needed your help. You grinding away, whatever level you were, and helping out was helping everyone. All those meaningful mobs that you're downing and just taking these mats and making your bandages and things like that, tossing them in the pile, you were helping and not selling them on the auction house for $1. So that was the choice that you had to make. However, if you decided that you actually needed these materials and you weren't going to be handing them into the war effort, or perhaps you weren't farming them and you needed to buy some off the auction house, you needed to be prepared to cough up a pretty penny for the items that were currently being handed into the war effort, because you weren't going to get a fair price at that particular point in time. You were going to have to pay out the wazoo for a lot of this stuff. There were obviously linen, thorium, leather shortages. So, did you gather these and sell them for a high price yourself on the auction house? Or, if you were trying to get them, did you cough up the money from your own wallet? Write to the show and let me know what you did. Feedback at countdowntoclassic.com. But the world was at war, and you had to decide what you were going to do. And no other event prior to this, or really since, has made grinding thousands of seemingly meaningless items feel so important. And the importance came from a variety of factors. It wasn't just max-level top-geared characters. It was everyone who was feeling the pinch. But the event also promoted massive cooperation between both factions, trading materials that were more easily acquired on the other side for theirs. There were some items that was far, far easier for the Horde to amass, and there were some items that were much easier for the Alliance to come by. So, what was the answer? Neutral auction houses seem to happen a lot. We're selling them for very, very cheap, effectively giving them up for free almost, and cross-factional trading by that way was very much so a thing. And players found themselves forging new friendships from places that they never thought they'd find a friend, the filthy Horde or the scummy Alliance. And for a moment, some bridges may have been mended. Of course, they were quickly burnt and forgotten about soon after the gates of the Ahn'Qiraj were opened, but we'll get on that later. Now, I mentioned the boxes of the Ahn'Qiraj war effort supplies, and I mentioned the signets, but I won't get into what you could do with those. There's plenty of information online if you're wondering what you could trade those in for. Now, interesting, the one question that I had, because like I said, I didn't really take part in the AQ war effort as much, well, at all, really, I would think, because during this patch, I wasn't playing WoW a whole lot. Even though I had started the game, I was like, a level 10 playing 1-2 hours a week. I didn't really know what I was doing. I really got stuck into the game by the time patch 1.10 came out. So this is all a bit wishy-washy to me. But one of the questions I always remember having was, how the hell did we know, with those incredible amounts of items that we had to gather, how the fuck did we know where we were at? Was there someone keeping count? Well, yes, turns out there was. There were NPCs about, such as Field Marshal Snowfall for the Alliance and Warlord Gorchuk for the Horde, who would tell you about the progress that you were making for all of the turn-in items. And there was also an NPC for the opposite faction that would tell you how the other side was going as well, see who's sort of pulling their weight, and then maybe you could give the Horde a bit of shit for being a bit behind, or the Horde give the Alliance a bit of shit for basically not doing anything. But once all that was done, you've gathered the mats. Now we move on to the second step, and that was obtaining the Scepter of the Sands for use by one player. So how the heck did we go about that? Well, in restoring the scepter, you might ask, what was this mighty item? What is, or what was this Scepter of the Shifting Sands that was so important? Well, WoWWiki describes it as the following. The Scepter of the Shifting Sands is an item created from an extremely long quest chain. Yeah, no shit, and we'll get into that. The beginning of the quest chain begins in Cenarian Hold. This scepter is required to ring the gong that opens the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj, thus allowing the entire server access to both the ruins of Ahn'Qiraj and the Temple of Ahn'Qiraj, the two raids. Now, without stepping on next week's lore episode too much, I will just give you a little bit of a brief history of the scepter by, first of all, cutting to the Bronze Dragonflight. Now, the Bronze Dragonflight are dragons with yellow bronze scales who can breathe superheated sand. During the Ordering of Azeroth, which was the moment that the Titans shaped the world of Azeroth as we know it, the Titan Aman'Thul, aka the High Father, the oldest and wisest Titan who was the leader of the Titan Pantheon, blessed the wise Nozdormu. Nozdormu, the Timeless One, is an aspect of the Bronze Dragonflight and the Guardian of Time. He and his brood were granted the ability to time travel and given a mastery of temporal magic. Generally stoic and detached from current events, the Bronze Dragonflight are rare to interact with mortals unless they require help in safeguarding the one true timeline. So once the Kingdom of Ahn'Qiraj was closed off and the Scarab Wall put in place by the Bronze Dragonflight, the Dragonflight forged two mystical artifacts, the Scarab Gong and the Scepter of the Shifting Sands. The dragons entrusted the scepter to Fandral Steghelm, Archdruid of Darnassus, who is in a constant power struggle with Tyrande Whisperwind, High Priestess of Elune, and was one of the architects of the plan to create Teldrassil. Should the need ever arise to enter Ahn'Qiraj again, Fandral could use this artifact to open the Scarab Wall. When the Scarab Wall was forged by the Bronze Dragonflight, despite having stymied the Qiraji threat for now, Fandral, who had worked obviously together with the Bronze Dragonflight in defeating the Qiraji, found no solace in the victory and was still tormented by the death of his son, Valstan, who had been ripped in two in front of his very eyes, and a number of other Night Elves, by the cruel Qiraji commander General Rajax. In a rage, Fandral shattered the Scepter of the Shifting Sands into 3 pieces, and the pieces became lost for the next 1,000 years. The Bronze Dragonflight were not thoroughly impressed with Fandral's move in breaking the scepter in 3. They found it disrespectful and vowed never to ally themselves again with mortal races. The Bronze Dragonflight gave those 3 pieces of the scepter to the dragons Azuragos, Aranicus, and Valistraz. The sealing of the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj did, however, have an effect that wasn't planned by the Bronze Dragonflight. Cthulhu began to grow in power, and the few Night Elves remaining in Silithus noticed this power with an increase in Qiraji activity. So, the Bronze Dragonflight began to search for a champion to reconstruct the scepter and destroy the Qiraji and Cthulhu once and for all. And guess what? That was one of us. So, in restoring the Scepter of the Shifting Sands, it really did involve a very long series of quests that required the efforts of a pretty well-coordinated raiding guild, or supported by other top guilds within a faction. Because of the reputation requirements of a certain farming quest, one player from each side will typically be designated as that faction's scepter bearer. So, what was that quest chain? Well, I won't go into the full details because it's pretty elaborate, but there's a lot of videos on YouTube if you're interested. I'll just give you a little bit of a summary. We'll zip through this as quickly as we can. Now, to reassemble the Scepter of the Shifting Sands, you had to acquire 3 shards that had been distributed to the red, blue, and green dragonflights. Now, to get the shard, you had to start the quest at Velistraz, kill him, and then clear Blackwing Lair in 5 hours after that, including killing Nefarian. If you killed Nefarian, but didn't do it within 5 hours, then you failed and you got a different drop. The blue shard was probably the most elaborate of the steps, and it involved a lot of work. You had to do the following. Learn Draconic, kill multiple unique outdoor raid bosses, assemble a fishing buoy crafted out of the most expensive crafting materials in the game, then cap it off by killing Moors, another outdoor raid boss fished up with the buoy that broadcasted a server-wide message on death, alerting every player online that you had done the deed. You then went on to the green shard, which basically involved killing a lot of corrupt green dragons, going to Moonglade to take on Ahn'Qiraj, and then there was a server-wide event in Moonglade, which really more than one raid group had to take part in. And again, with this event, a server-wide message would be sent out notifying players that it was going on. So this actually drew a lot of players to the event, and as you might hear later, caused a lot of grief amongst the guilds trying to get it done because there was so much server crashing and lag, and it was just causing mayhem. Now, apparently this particular world event was quite easily griefable, where rival raid groups that didn't want you to finish your scepter could set themselves at war with the Cenarian Circle and kill Keeper Remulos. If Remulos died, you couldn't finish the event and you failed. However, the prerequisite for all of that I've just mentioned was that you actually had to kill Broodlord Lashlayer in Blackwing Lair, loot his head, which could only be looted by one person per kill, turn that in so that you can then get the right to grind Bronze Dragonflight reputation, which required pretty much killing thousands upon thousands of elite Silithid mobs, which you would have to obviously do with your friends. This series of quests was more than a hefty undertaking and far from the light-hearted. Your raid group or guild would basically choose someone to be the champion, and everybody would work together to make sure that that person got the Scepter of the Shifting Sands. Even with all these people working together, we're talking a time investment of absolute weeks for this one. The quest chain was so elaborate and involved that even when Burning Crusade came out, people tried to take it on thinking it would all be pretty easy now, but it wasn't. They were still struggling. In the end, it wasn't uncommon for this quest chain to actually take casual players years to complete. Now, once you had restored the scepter to its former glory and put all three pieces together, there were a lot of really cool quest rewards from all the quests that you had undertaken. I won't go into them again. You can look them all up online and see some of the fat loot that you could get from that kind of stuff. But the most notable reward from that extremely elaborate series of quests was the completion of the Banger Gong quest, granting the player the legendary Scarab mount that absolutely everyone wanted to get their hands on back in the day. It was only available during the main war event, which occurred upon the initial ringing of the gong and lasted 10 hours thereafter. The mount was usable both inside and outside of the Temple of Ahn'Qiraj. Once the war event was completed, the legendary mount could no longer be obtained by any means. Now we move on to the third step of the Ahn'Qiraj war plan, if you will, and that was getting the bands together at the gates and the opening of the gates themselves now that we had all the stuff that we needed to actually crack them open. So, once all the necessary war supplies had been gathered, the combined forces of the Alliance and the Horde would begin transporting NPCs, equipment, and supplies to Silithus. 5 days had to pass while the supplies were sent by Zeppelin, which actually couldn't be seen occurring by the players, but it was happening behind closed doors. And as the days passed, the stockpiles of supplies that had been accumulating slowly diminish until everything is in place, at which point the holder of the scepter can ring the mighty gong to cause the Scarab Wall to open. Now, the actual official Scarab Lord, lore-wise, responsible for banging the gong and starting the Second War of the Shifting Sands, is Night Elf Priestess Shiromar, a veteran of the First War of the Shifting Sands. But the first player to bang the Scarab Gong, and anyone else who followed within 10 hours after that, mostly only 1 to 3 people per server, obtained that Scarab Lord title that I mentioned, and obviously then got the mount that came with it as well. Although it was possible to complete the quest line for the Scepter of the Shifting Sands even when the gates were already open, doing so at a later time would not reward the quest solver with the Black Karaji Resonating Crystal or the Scarab Lord title. Now you've hit the gong, what happens from there? Well, this now starts a 10-hour-long continent-wide event to begin, preceded by a global message to everyone on the server stating the name of the person as the Scarab Lord, champion of the Bronze Dragon Flight, has rung the Scarab Gong. The ancient gates of Ahn'Qiraj open, revealing the horrors of a forgotten war. Now, the most immediate effect, obviously, is that the gates of Ahn'Qiraj actually open. And then what happens is a lot of very powerful monsters and bosses start coming through those doors. The combined forces of the Horde and the Alliance charge forth, with High Overlord Varrock Sourfang as their supreme commander, and we had to stop the Karaji before they could overrun Silithus and eventually Kalimdor. The Karaji General Rajax commanded the opposing forces, and an endless flow of Silithids and Anubisaths flooded Silithus. Rajax is a primary militant commander of the Karaji. He was described in the War of the Shifting Sands as a towering monstrosity, swinging clawed limbs, looming over all, and always shouting commands to the insect soldiers of Karaji and Silithid during battle. During the War of the Shifting Sands, Rajax clashed with Fandral and Valstan Steghelm, the leaders of the Night Elf forces. Later, he personally killed Valstan, as we said earlier, by brutally vivisecting him, basically, in front of his father. Every one of the mobs encountered in this particular moment was basically a minor raid boss, and players had to work together to bring these guys down. There was no soloing any of this stuff. But what was in it for us, you might ask? Well, the loot was pretty cool, so it was kind of worth it to jump in on these fights if you had the gear to pull it off. Now, many of the bosses that you encountered over this 10-hour period were basically dropping bind-on-equip items. One of the rarest epics in the game for years was Tibu's Blazing Longsword. It was rare because it could only drop off elite mobs higher than level 60, which there were very few of in the game. Tibu's Blazing Longsword had a less than 0.01% drop rate, but it looked really, really cool. If you saw a Tibu's Blazing Longsword during Vanilla WoW, chances were very good that it was found during that battle for Ahn'Qiraj and had just kind of been passed around on the auction house a few times with basically no one equipping it, just going from seller to seller to seller. Now, Tibu's was highly, highly coveted. It was a large sign of status and considered a bigger sign of status than some legendaries like Thunder Fury or Sulfurous. But the battle taking place outside the gates of Ahn'Qiraj weren't the only place where the action was. The battle actually stretched all across Kalimdor, with these Karaji resonating crystals popping up and summoning some mobs for players all through the region to take on. So over the course of the 10 hours, not only were things going ballistic at the gates, but if you happen to wander by some of these crystals, you and your friends may get a bit of a tap on the shoulder from a nice little mob saying, "Hey, we look like an insect. Do you want to play?" And in which case they might. So we were all really chipping in and doing our part. It was a battle on a truly grand scale, and we haven't really seen much like it since. But obviously, with all of us having put in so much time and effort over the last few weeks or months, and again, not me, it was you who was doing it all, the players obviously had a very vested interest in seeing the fruits of their labor. And so many people logged on and gravitated towards Silithus to see what was going on. But also, worldwide, and particularly, on Kalimdor, a lot was going down, and people were gravitating towards certain areas, resulting in high populations, stacking up the numbers on servers, and causing a little bit of stress on the game. But it wasn't stuff just as simple as a server crash that people were experiencing, although that was happening too. Things were actually really going to shit. There was unbearable lag, multiple hour-long queues to get onto the game, and servers not being able to keep up with where people were if they died, and the game would take them to default graveyards in Stone Talon and Westfall, even if they were perhaps nowhere nearby. And also, boats were doing really crazy things. The boats at Kalimdor would simply disappear from underneath everybody aboard it, dumping them into fatigue waters where they would obviously perish. The boat would sometimes hit a loading screen and simply just not leave it. You'd stay on that loading screen for 20 minutes, then perhaps find yourself on a bit of a ghost ship in the middle of a glitched out area, not knowing what the hell was going on. But anyway, once all the mayhem at the gates was done, raiding guilds could proceed now into the 20 and 40-man instances at their leisure. Now, as I mentioned earlier, while everything was happening at the Ahn'Qiraj gates, large floating obelisks called resonating crystal formations would appear in Silithus, Tanarus, Feralus, the Barrens, Thousand Needles, and Ungoro Crater. These obelisks would alternately mind control player characters in their vicinity and spawn high-level monsters like Colossal Anubisath Warbringers and various Silithid. After 10 hours of this, the crystals and their spawn would disappear, bringing the whole Ahn'Qiraj war to an end. And from this point forward, the gates of Ahn'Qiraj would remain open. It's also worth noting, everyone, that there were 3 time-limited quests available in the Cenarian Hold during the 10-hour opening event. And if you happen to go and check those out, they were just mainly delivery quests that had a 2-hour time limit that some people knocked off pretty easily. There was something worth checking out as well if you were so inclined. Now, how did all of this organization take place when you had to get the Horde and the Alliance at the gates at the same time en masse to take on these numerous Ahn'Qiraji threats? Well, the organization behind it all generally went like this. Some servers coordinated their efforts through their realm forums, which obviously would make sense. And some even went as far as to have dedicated websites to help organize their Ahn'Qiraj war efforts. Now, after having heard about all of that, if you're wondering who the very first realm to unlock everything was, it was the realm Medivh on January 23rd, 2006. So that's interesting. It took them 17 days only to open the gates of Ahn'Qiraj. That's crazy when they say some people obviously took months. Now, the first 5 US realms that completed the task were, as I said, Medivh number 1, then Manaroth, then Zul'jin, then Hyjal, then Icecrown. Now, the EU realms went as follows: Kael'thas, Magtheridon, Archimonde, Azshara, and Destramath. The world's first scepter was acquired by the player Tryphon of the guild Macabre on the Manaroth server. So that's something interesting to note as well. Interesting that the world's first scepter was put together on the Manaroth server that came second to Medivh by 5 days. So they got the scepter first, but they couldn't get the shit together to open the gates first. So maybe they were a bit behind on mats, I'm obviously guessing. But why have we been talking about this? Why have I just spent all this time talking about a simple event? It was just the opening of some gates, Josh. Why do we care? This wasn't an instance. Why haven't you been talking about the lore? We're here for the lore, man. What happened to that? Well, the reason I've just spent all this time talking about the opening of the gates event is this. Despite all of the issues that I listed earlier, This was, as I highlighted, one of the more beloved events of the game, and there's a lot of people, if you search through the forums, who spew nothing but love and affection for this time period of Vanilla WoW. This particular patch and this event that a lot of people have as a shared experience is very, very fondly looked back on. Despite all the glitches, despite all the server instability, people didn't really care so much because they were having so much fun, in that it wasn't really game breaking until the actual opening of the gates for some people, which might have been a bit of a letdown. But it was still an experience, and it's one that they've never really had again. It was an absolutely unprecedented cross-factional cooperation, planning and coordination with the opening of the gates and the scepter building. It worked for the most part. Some guilds did it right, with all the speaking on the forums, speaking on a website, saying, hey guys, hey look, we're going to open it at 8 p.m. on this particular day, be there or be square, blah, blah, blah. Some didn't really quite do it right and opened it at 4 o'clock in the morning, so not many people could really experience it. But some might argue, as you'll hear soon, that, well, you had to kind of open it at odd hours because otherwise the server would become so jam-packed that the game was almost unplayable. So it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't type situation. But anyway, with all of that now being done, let's go and hear what you all said about the opening of the Gates of the Ahn'Qiraj back in the day with That's What We Said. Each Wednesday on Countdown to Classic, I take you back to some of the forum postings from back in the day about the content that we've just discussed. Or they may be more recent postings just reflecting on what people remember from their experiences at the time. Now, I've dug up a fair few about the opening of the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj because obviously a lot of people commented on this because, as I said, it was a very fond memory for many people. Some not so fond. But I'm going to leave my commentary to a little bit of a minimum on this because we're already dragging for time. But there's a fair few posts that I just want to go through. So let's start with this one, with the title of this thread being The Day the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj Opened on the WoW official forums. And user Mailzan says this: the day the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj opened was the most fun I've ever had in a video game ever. It was so unbelievably epic, and it stands head and shoulders over pretty much every moment in WoW. My first run-throughs of Ulduar are the only things that are close. I know it was horribly buggy. I know it was complete chaos. I know the employees must have been working round the clock to bring the servers back up. The fact that I remember the day in clear detail 7 years later proves my point. It was worth it. And the reason I brought up that post is they say it was the most fun they've had in a video game ever. Wow, that's a pretty big statement, but I respect it. I mean, if you enjoyed the opening of the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj that much, hell, and you say it was one of the most, or the most, iconic video game event that you've experienced, sure, let's throw it on the pile. I think of things like Aerys's death in Final Fantasy VII, John Marston's last stand in Red Dead Redemption, and the final scene of The Last of Us kind of stuck with me as well. They're my iconic video game moments. And obviously there's a lot of websites where you can, go to the top 50 or the top 100 video game moments. And I haven't seen anyone talking about the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj, but fuck it, it probably deserves to be on there. That's a really good point and a bit of food for thought. Now, the next post is from user Marza, who says this: I was on Medivh back when it was a good server and we opened the gates first. It was an insanely fun time. These days, it would probably be the norm on high-end servers, but back then, it seemed most had a really hard time organizing things to get it open fast. We had 4 alliance guilds and Ascent all cooperating to pass stuff through the neutral auction house, and ostracizing those who tried to snipe our auctions back when it sort of mattered to do that. Hundreds of people farming garbage like linen and purple lotus for 12 to 13 hour stretches at a time. Lots of raffles and incentives for non-raiders to participate. And of course, our server got absolutely crushed when it came time to actually open the gates, even going as far as Galahad, the GM of Fury, pretending to be in a queue for 4 hours so that people would get discouraged and stop clogging the server while he sat on an alt. I remember watching the Anubisaths covering Silithus and doing nothing as the server crashed repeatedly, unable to cope. I remember finally getting to fight the giant colossi in the caves after hours and hours, probably 5 or 6 in the morning, with still a nearly full raid just because nobody wanted to log off in the middle of all that was going on. We divvied it up so that Ascent got one, Fury got one, and we got one. Good times. We got the one that did I don't even know how far, 10,000 yard maybe knockback. He would knock you from the Western Hive so that you hit the mountains in the west of Silithus and rebounded and landed at Cenarian Enclave almost. The best part was AQ itself. Super buggy and untuned the first week or two while nobody else was opening the gates. Skiram was fine, Bug Trio worked, Sartura was a mess, and everyone had to skirt around while we distract chained her. She would just annihilate raid groups for the first week or so. Fangchris and Huhuran were basically broken and just sat there and let you kill them. I miss those days. That was a bit of a long one, but the point is those were very specific examples from the server that actually did it all first. This person just gave us a blow-by-blow of what actually happened on the server that made history. And I found that really interesting. I've basically been told about the blood, sweat and tears, as I mentioned earlier, that went into it. Like 12, 13-hour grinding sessions for particular materials. Like, fuck that. Jeez, I don't know if I could have done that. Kudos to you. The next post comes from Fancy Pants, who says this, and this is about the 10-hour window. It's Blizzard's fault for making the window far too small. Given the amount of time that it takes to create the scepter, they could have made the window a week long and it would have been fine. Now, the point here and why I bring this up is there were some criticisms too pointed at Blizzard through the Ahn'Qiraj effort. Some people did feel that the 10-hour window was way too short. Like, what if you had to go to work that day and you missed the whole thing that you just put months of time into? What if for some reason you experienced that horrible lag and server crash and game-breaking issues that stopped people from enjoying it on their server? Did you not have a right to have a longer window of time where you could actually see when you spent those 12, 13, 14-hour sessions farming mats? Anyway, something to chew on. The next post comes from user Lagspike, who says this, and this is in relation to WoW Classic, so perhaps your ears should perk up. So I have an idea for a change to Vanilla WoW. Hear me out before you say no. Assuming we get to experience the opening of Ahn'Qiraj again, should the opening event be extended from 10 hours to, say, 24 or even 48 hours? It would ensure most people get to experience this historical event and won't have to miss it due to some unavoidable circumstance such as work or school. You know there's going to be at least one server with that one jerk who'll open the gates at 4 a.m. And that's kind of a solution to the problem that the last post posed. Well, hey, developers, World of Warcraft Classic, changes, no changes. Do we consider extending this window of time so we never get anything like this happening again? We've learnt from the mistakes of the past. Let's make sure no one bitches about it the second time round. It's something to chew on. And the next post by Melaroy goes into a little bit extra about why people were so upset about some things that happened with the opening of the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj on their server. We were talking about this in Discord last night. Apparently on my home realm of Alexstrasza, our guilds were working together to open the gates at the same time. But then one guild, Ninja, completed it in the middle of the night. Then our illustrious Scarab Lord transferred off and was never seen again. Players who have played here since Classic are apparently still salty about that. I won't say the name of the person, but allegedly they were named after a berry-like fruit. Sounds like that Seinfeld episode where it's like they're named after a female reproductive organ or whatever it was. But the point raised there is, and I would have loved to have found some more specific posts on this. I'm sure I've read them in the past, but couldn't find it for this particular podcast episode. A lot of people did bitch about these so-called ninja openings of the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj, opening the gates at really inopportune times. Tell me, were you the subject of such an occurrence? Did you get screwed over by your server's opening of the gates and you didn't quite get to see it because it was at a shitty time? Write to the show and let me know. Feedback at countdowntoclassic.com. But the next post we go to talks about why perhaps it wasn't such a good idea to go ahead with that change. And they say the following. Sorry, I've forgotten their name. There is a problem that comes with that change. During the opening of the gate, a bunch of stuff happens like mobs appearing everywhere. It's great. Everyone has a good old time. The thing is, these mobs give reputation for the AQ40 faction Brood of Nozdormu. Increasing the time this event goes on might break the game in the sense that everyone will get the max rep they can get from killing these mobs easier. However, supposedly this rep ends at 2,999 out of 3,000 of neutral, so it might not be that big of an issue, but it's something to consider. Overall, I think this little alteration to getting rep would be overlooked to give everyone the chance to experience the event, as it only happens once per server. And there's another point against that change raised by user 2psir, who says this: I think the coolest mount in the game is the Scarab. Why? Because of its limited supply. Supply and demand. We all want it, but there's only a handful out there. That makes it valuable. It's like a nice sports car, say a Lamborghini. They only made 200 of these. With the time frame increase, that allows potentially more mounts to be given out, because anyone who completes Bang a Gong within 10 hours also receives a Black Karaji resonating crystal. That means a server might see one Scarab mount only. It means it maybe will see 2 or 3. Personally, I love that, and I don't want this to be any different. Very good point there, that the ramifications of potentially extending the time window period would have more of these people riding around on these very, very exclusive mounts that we all absolutely wanted back in the day. The next comment comes from user Gruntcake on Reddit, who said this on a thread titled, "One overlooked thing, the Ahn'Qiraj opening will be much better this time round." And they say, I remember the AQ opening. While being awesome, it was laggy and constantly crashed. This time around, hardware has developed a lot since 2006. Modern hardware is on Blizzard's side and the players, and it will hopefully mean the AQ events will be largely lag and crash free. Very good point there, and actually I hadn't even thought about that, is now we're dealing with upgraded hardware, upgraded servers, everything's, 12 years later. Perhaps we're in a much better position now technologically to deal with the stress that would come with everyone jumping on for an AQ opening. Very good point there. The next point comes back to the WoW official forums from user IllustJuice, who says this: the only thing I'd like to suggest would be to change the material turn-ins to be something else of the same level bracket. Reason being is that everyone will just hoard the required turn-ins and instantly unlock AQ40 when the patch drops. If the turn-ins are slightly tweaked, this changes. Now, if you haven't heard the previous episodes of Countdown to Classic, I highly recommend that you please go and download them all and listen to them all, because this is a very topic that we touched on, I think, last week in perhaps episode number 8, 7, 9, I can't remember. I like that I've now done so many episodes that I can't remember what I said in one of them, so that's fantastic. But we definitely recently touched on whether or not the AQ materials should be changed for WoW Classic, because for that very reason, we know what the materials are. People will start hoarding them from day one to benefit their own server, obviously, and get the jump on people, or just, perhaps play some auction house mayhem. But if Blizzard were to change the items, all of that is changed, obviously, and now all of a sudden we're all in the same boat, and we don't know what the hell the items are going to be that they're going to ask for. So you replicate the actual vanilla experience of the AQ war effort, where it just gets sprung on us. Ta-da! You need 700 million of this particular item. And we're like, what the fuck? We got to get to work, guys. Let's do this. So I think that would be fun. And whether you categorize that as a change, some people say, well, no, it's not a change. If you want the vanilla experience, that's what you should do. Fair point. Now, the final point that we're going to bring up in That's What We Said This Week is a long one, but my goodness, is this a good one. And I want you all to listen intently to this tongue bathing of the AQ war effort. And this is from user Bergs on the WoW official forums. Here we go. Now, I should say that, Bergs was actually replying to a short post. I'm just going to read that one first quickly from a user, Sendy, who said this. From all I've read and heard, the AQ server event was awful, laggy, crashy, and worst of all, the raiders who were geared and capable of handling the elites ran past them into the instance. So, this was the reply to that from Bergs. Oh, you heard something, did you? Well, here's something else for you to hear. No, it wasn't. I was there. I've been playing since launch. Check my achievements. I wasn't in the Scarab Lords Guild. I wasn't a top-end raider. My guild killed Razorgore just before vanilla ended and we never got past Vale. But I did know the Scarab Lord. The whole server did. Because back then, there were no transfers and no cross-realm content. Everyone knew each other. The server was a community. You did dungeons together. You grinded for rep together. You did PvP and battlegrounds together. And you farmed the AQ mats together. It was a community effort. Blizzard didn't open those gates. The gates didn't open after a set amount of time like so many do in the games these days. One guild did not open those gates. I recall upgrading 512 megabytes of RAM during vanilla. Was my frame rate reduced during the AQ opening event? Yes. I was getting about 15 to 20 frames per second, a few frames per second below a lot of console games. Did the WoW servers crash and burn? No. Were the raids and instances lagged out? No. Was Eastern Kingdoms lagged out? No. Was Kalimdor lagged out? No. Was Silithus laggy? Slightly. Did the servers have to be rolled back? No. Did anybody die in real life? No. Was the event fun? Fuck yes. My guild was so terrible that we struggled in Molten Core and Zul'Gurub for all of vanilla, and yet we were able to participate in the AQ opening content. The big raid boss bugs walking through Silithus would kill our tanks almost instantly, so we formed a line to NPCs in Silithus. Each of us would draw aggro on the raid bosses, eventually leading them to NPCs that would tank for us. We killed many raid boss bugs that day with just a little bit of ingenuity. Not only did we get to participate in opening the gates and the opening event itself, but we were also able to clear almost all of AQ20. Now stop spreading this vanilla sucked because some guy with zero evidence that he even played the game back then told me it did. Crap. I think that's an amazing post, and I think that's one of the greatest summaries of the AQ war effort experience and the opening of the gates. You guys write into the show now and tell me if you agree with that post, or tell me if you greatly disagree, if that's wrong, like a very incorrect assessment of how it was, if it was so broken that you couldn't possibly have had fun, or that, as that user suggests, there might have been some issues, but this was possibly the greatest time of vanilla WoW. Feedback at countdowntoclassic.com, guys. Write in and let me know. And with all of that done, now it's time for anger management. Each episode, Countdown to Classic comes to you with some of the angriest posts that I've found through the week about the content that we've just been discussing. So I can't go too nuts this week because I've actually got someone staying in the house. so I won't yell like I normally do. I won't quite whisper, but I might just say it in my normal voice. How about that? I'll bring the screaming back next episode. Now, the first submission comes from user Skooks, who says the following, and I think this is all very tongue-in-cheek, so take it as much, but it's still a bit of fun for anger management. Blizzard, this isn't fair. It's not my fault I wasn't playing when the gates were opened. I demand a black Kiraji battle tank. The people who were playing at the time had a chance to get it, but I wasn't playing then. Therefore, I deserve a chance at it. Sure, I was technically playing when the gates were opened, but I was still brand new and didn't even have a level 40 character yet. I also demand a chance to get the corrupted Ashbringer. Again, I wasn't able to get it at the time, so it's not fair. Why do you insist on punishing newer players who haven't been giving you money as long as the older players? This isn't fair. It's not fair. It's not fair. Yes, I think very tongue-in-cheek there. But the next submission comes from Netheris, who on Reddit, who wasn't being tongue-in-cheek when they said this. Our server never stayed up for more than 30 seconds the entire night, so my character was in Silithus near the gong, but I personally was just staring at load screens the entire night. Well, I'm sorry you had that experience. That would have bummed me out too. But the next submission comes from Seafrost2010, who says this. I was standing at those gates in Stormwind with an instance portal behind them because I thought those were the AQ gates. I was really disappointed. And I would have been disappointed too if I were you, standing at the wrong place wondering why the hell the Great War that I was told about wasn't unfurling before me. God, that would have been disappointing, being at the wrong place thinking, are these the gates of AQ? Sorry, I'm a little bit lost. Anyway, the final submission comes from user Manthrax, who says this in relation to the fact that we don't quite get events like AQ anymore. Yeah, Blizz is replacing the great chain quests of the past with the no-brain quest line of the future. Capitalism is and they blank it out, but I presume they wanted to put the C word in there. I'm thinking. Anyway, that's been anger management for the week. Now it's time for Tidbits. Every Wednesday, Countdown to Classic comes to you with a few little-known pieces of information about the content that we've just been discussing. Now, however, with this Ahn'Qiraj episode, I've got a funny feeling that these tidbits aren't so little known. You'll all know this, but we'll cover it anyway. Now, the reopening of the gates. When patch 3.0.2 was released, the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj were briefly closed due to a bug that reset the gates on each server and gave all characters of the same race and class as the original opener the ability to speak Draconic. All mobs spawned during the event were respawned as well. The supplies didn't need to be gathered, and if the quest chain was done previously, one would need to simply turn it in and reopen the gates, giving them the mount and Scarab Lord title. The next point is the Hammer of Grief, a level 80 two-handed mace, actually uses the same skin as the Scepter of the Shifting Sands. So it's interesting to know that there are two items that look alike, and one being obviously an incredibly rare one. Next up, I found a couple of interviews for you that I thought you all might be interested in, and the first is actually a quote from J. Allen Brack about some Ahn'Qiraj issues that Blizzard had back in the day, and Brack says the following. This is from a few years ago. Sure, I joined in January of 2006, so WoW had been out a little bit more than a year. Ahn'Qiraj had just come out, and so there were a lot of hot fixes, and looking at Cthulhu, there was a lot of clean-up effort from the Ahn'Qiraj war effort that was going on, and the gate. That was a great idea that had a lot of problems that were still going on when I first joined. Now, the reason I brought up that quote is I found it interesting that he says that there was a clean-up effort on Blizzard's part from the Ahn'Qiraj event and the opening of the gates. So obviously it wasn't just the bugs in the moment that Blizzard were effectively trying to deal with. there was perhaps some fallout from that event on the development side, and they really needed to figure out server-wide on multiple servers how to deal with the issues that had arisen. So I found that quite interesting. The next interview I found was with Jeff Kaplan, and this is from a New York Times interview on January 28 of 2006, just after the release of AQ. So this is going back a long, long ways. So anyway, let's hear what Kaplan had to say about AQ. He was asked, "Tell me about your general approach to top-level content and how you can appeal to such a diverse user base." And Kaplan answers as follows. "What we constantly do is look at the whole picture. We need to address an audience like my mum, who plays once in a while but still manages to get to level 60 and doesn't raid, all the way to people who play 14 hours a day who need less sleep than the rest of us. People talk about the game fundamentally changing at level 60, and they're right. There are people who are seeking that hardcore endgame experience, but to people who casually follow the quests and just ended up at level 60, it can be very jarring to them. We're trying to put in more content for them, like the field duty quests in Ahn'Qiraj. But the resolution we're all hoping for is the expansion, which will give those players more World of Warcraft as they know it." And then in parentheses, the interviewer notes that Mr. Kaplan also said that the game would soon add a new casual player-friendly armor set obtained through a multi-part quest. The first parts can be completed by a solo player, he said, while the later parts will require a group of no more than 5 people. Now, the reason I brought up that particular quote is it raises the question because it's quite eyebrow-raising when he's focusing so much on needing to obviously satisfy casual and hardcore players. And he's talking about developing Ahn'Qiraj and having certain quests in Ahn'Qiraj there for the casual player. And that is what a lot of people enjoyed about Ahn'Qiraj, is that everyone could get involved. But then, obviously, with the expansions that followed and with the state that we find Warcraft in now, some people love it, some people don't like it. Do we point to the genesis of the casual ethos that Blizzard has developed over the years at moments like this, when they're coming up with Ahn'Qiraj, going, well, we don't just want to appeal to hardcore players, which is fine, but we really need to gravitate towards the casuals and appease them in some way. Maybe AQ was ground zero for that casual vibe about the game, who knows? But he also goes on in that same interview to answer the next question, and the question was, what is your reaction to how the efforts to open Ahn'Qiraj are going? And Kaplan said the following. This is the first time that we've really put all of the power in the hands of the players. So you see some really interesting things going on. In some places, you see multiple Uber guilds that have treated each other with respect, or who have called a truce, and are engaged in some massive collective farming. You see a lot of guilds setting up contests to encourage others to participate. The event really comes down to the politics and diplomacy on each realm. But we don't want to punish players on realms that aren't cooperating. So in a week or two, the resources will start to just come in on their own. So we gave just enough time to let all of the servers show their feathers and strut their stuff. This is the time to see which servers can really put in the effort. And the reason I brought up that particular quote is I just think it's interesting to get Blizzard's inside thoughts on the kind of social experiment that they conducted with Ahn'Qiraj, because that's kind of what it was at the end of the day. As Kaplan says, that was the first time they put all of the power in the hands of the players. They left it with us and just said, fuck it. Let's see what these guys do. Will they work together or will they implode? And different servers reacted differently. And I'm sure Blizzard really enjoyed watching different situations unfurl. And I've got no doubt that they would have cheered on as these huge Uber guilds, as Kaplan puts it, really banded together and worked cross-faction to achieve that common goal. And I still find it really, really quite the fascinating case study as well. It is a moment like no other, and that's why people always clamour for something like AQ. People loved it. It brought us together at the end of the day. But as they say, all good things must come to an end, and the final tidbit of the week is the permanent closure of the event, On February 6, 2009, sometime after patch 3.0.8a, Bornak, a blue poster on the forums, stated that the Ahn'Qiraj gates would automatically be open on all new future realms. He would also later clarify in the thread that there are no plans to have an alternative method to obtain the Black Qiraji battle tank. On February 11th, 2009, a day after patch 3.0.9, the server Nessingwary in the US was the world's first realm to be opened in this way. The final step of closure came with the release of patch 3.2. The commendation offices in all major cities were removed. However, in patch 3.3, the resource collectors and quests were unexpectedly brought back, though it was a simple glitch and has been fixed. It shows that the programming for the AQ war effort still exists to that day, or perhaps to this day, or perhaps they're rebuilding it all for Classic. Who knows? We're about to find out. Now, just before I let you all go, I want to give you a few shout-outs and some updates about the show. Now, you'll be happy to know, guess what? Belarus Watch is officially over. We did it, guys. We cracked that coveted Belarus market. And to that listener in Belarus, I say thank you so much and welcome on board. Now tell everyone else in the country about the show and then we'll be happy. No, thank you so much. And guys, you know, if you had something to do with that Belarus download, I say thank you so much. But on that note, I'm now going to send out a little bit of a activity I would ask the listeners to partake in. Please, everyone, tell a friend about this show. I can only do so much with the advertising about this show before I get the ban hammer smacked down on me in certain forums and things like that. MMO Champion wasn't very happy a few weeks ago when I tried to basically say, like, hey, I do a WoW podcast. They said, not on our watch, and wrote me a very sternly worded email. But, you know, these things happen. I do understand the prickly nature of advertising in forums. That's fine. But I need you guys, when you see the opportunity, tell a mate. Or if someone's talking in-game, be like, hey, guys, like this guy from Australia is doing a podcast on World of Warcraft Classic. It's the damnedest thing. You should all go listen. We want to grow the listener base so that I can bring you even more content. Because as those numbers go up, guess what? This show will get better and I'll be able to bring you more guests and things of that nature. And speaking of more guests, I have an update because I will be speaking to Super Soaker this Easter weekend. I'll be having a chat with him at some stage. We'll record a conversation and I do hope to publish that sometime in the next 7 to 10 days, let's say. So I'm very excited to get Countdown to Classic's first guest on the show. Now that Belarus Watch has ended, by the way, I should say, we're going to have to pick another country. So how about this? Countdown to Classic is now on Singapore Watch. Come on, Singapore. Pull your finger out and get on the show. I know there's got to be a boatload of people that play WoW in Singapore. Anyway, further shout-outs. I just want to say a big thank you again to everyone who's been joining the Discord channel. The new members are still rolling in by the day. I love seeing a few people come in every day. It's fantastic, and everyone has been so great. Just before recording this episode, I actually recorded a little bit late because I got caught up talking to a new member on the Discord channel who was really, really lovely guy. Shout out to Power Word John, who told me all about how he listens to the show and he loves listening to it at work every day, and he's really appreciating what's going on and it's getting him hungry for Classic again, and that's fantastic. And he was really engaged in the conversation and looking forward to getting throwing himself into the Discord channel. And I can't recommend this enough, everyone, because like I said, if you love just being able to text with a few people, a few like-minded people every day about World of Warcraft, then this is the avenue for you. I love sneaking around at work and slipping in a message about like, hey, let me talk some vanilla for a second when I should be doing far more important things. But it's just good fun, and waking up to a bunch of messages on my phone in the morning going, wow, that's like a World of Warcraft chat that I'm involved with that's not like online and open to like the whole world to come and troll. It's amazing because everyone's really nice. Come and join. The link's on the website and I'll put it again in the show notes here. Anyway, my final shout out comes to the listener whose name starts with G, who I won't even start to try to pronounce because I butchered it so badly last time. If you go back and listen to our last episode, there was an email that I read out from a listener whose, again, name started with G, and they wrote back to me. I invited them and said, please write me an angry email and tell me how badly I've butchered your name. And they very graciously wrote back to me and said, yes, you absolutely murdered my name, but that's fine. It's all good. And they were very, very polite and just appreciative of the fact that their story was read out on Countdown to Classic. And they corrected me saying, actually, they were Icelandic, not Swedish or Norwegian like I had wrongly presumed. And so I apologize profusely again to that listener. I promise to try to be more culturally sensitive to all of my listeners as we go forward. Please, guys, when you get in touch, let me know where you're from. It's all a bit of fun having this global audience, and I love getting all these different viewpoints from around the world. Now, the Monday episode obviously is coming up soon, and actually there might even be a surprise episode before that. We shall see how we go. But with the Monday episode, as I previewed to a few people today, there was some big news overnight with again, if you're not aware of him, Tips Out Baby, the channel from YouTube, has basically suggested that there's been a bit of a leak that he dropped, and the Classic WoW subreddit kind of went crazy over this one overnight, both for and against the news that was dropped and the manner in which it was dropped. That's going to be our lead news item on Monday, so I do look forward to that one. I'll have some heavy impressions of my own of how this went down, and I'll try to basically deliver that in as mature a fashion as I can. And as we do, we'll do the neutral, the pros and the cons here on Countdown to Classic. I reached out to Tip for comment on this story, and he graciously did write back to me and said, look, he'd love to, but he is absolutely and understandably swamped at the moment. So look, maybe one day we'll get him on the show. And on a final note, if any of you want to play with me, yours truly, on K3, I will be checking it out when it opens this weekend, just to have a look at what the private server community is doing these days and how a launch goes on a private server community. I just want to compare it with what we're getting in retail and obviously what we're going to get in Classic. I'm just trying to take everything into account. I'm not a big private server guy, but I'll just jump in and have a look and maybe do a few levels. But if you want to, have a chat, down a few mobs with me, get in touch with me. I'll let you know. I'll let you all know what my the username is, or my character's name is when I jump on. It's going to be something stupid like Podcast Wow or something like that. I'll be easily identifiable. So do hit me up and we'll try and organize something. But for now, everyone, that's the show. Thanks for coming along. I'll see you next time.